When the first solid proof of Neanderthal-human interbreeding emerged back in 2010, the story that reached the public was, understandably, a warm one. Headlines leaned into phrases like ancient romance and prehistoric love story, painting a picture of two kinds of humans meeting somewhere in the Middle East, falling for each other and quietly leaving behind a shared genetic legacy that still exists inside billions of people today. It's a comforting way to tell the story. It's also, according to a decade of closer genetic analysis since then, considerably too comforting. The actual DNA evidence tells a story that's far more complicated and in several specific, well-documented ways, considerably darker than the romantic version that made it into so many documentaries. It's a story involving infertility, population collapse, inbreeding, and a genetic asymmetry so stark that researchers are still working through exactly what it implies about how these two populations really interacted. To understand why the romantic framing doesn't hold up, it helps to look at exactly what got measured when scientists first compared Neanderthal and modern human genomes, and then look closely at what that comparison left conspicuously absent. The headline, finding from 2010, was straightforward enough. People of non-African ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA scattered throughout their genome. That part of the story is solid, extensively replicated, and not in dispute. But autosomal DNA, the general genetic material, inherited roughly equally from both parents, is only part of the picture. Human genomes also carry two other more specialized pieces of genetic material: mitochondrial DNA, passed down exclusively from mother to child, and in males, a Y chromosome, passed down exclusively from father to son. Together, these two lineages act like a pair of unbroken genetic threads, tracing direct maternal and paternal lines back through history with no mixing at all. When researchers went looking for Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA and Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA inside modern human populations, expecting to find at least some trace of it given the clear autosomal evidence of interbreeding, they found precisely none. Not a small amount. Not a rare surviving fragment in some isolated population somewhere. None anywhere in any modern human population studied so far. Sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely strange result if you're picturing a straightforward mutual relationship between two populations meeting as equals. If Neanderthal men and modern human women had children together, and if Neanderthal women and modern human men had children together, in anything resembling equal numbers over an extended period of contact, you would expect to find at least some surviving Neanderthal mitochondrial lineages and at least some surviving Neanderthal Y chromosome lineages somewhere in the modern human genetic record. We don't. Every single mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineage in every modern human population traces back exclusively to modern human ancestors, with zero measurable exception. If you're finding this genuinely surprising, that's exactly the reaction researchers had when the pattern first became clear. Go ahead and hit that like button. Because the explanation behind this missing genetic thread turns out to be one of the more sobering discoveries in the entire field of ancient human genetics. The leading explanation for this complete absence involves something geneticists call hybrid incompatibility. And it follows a well-documented biological pattern known as Haldane's rule. When two related but meaningfully diverged populations interbreed, it's extremely common for one sex of hybrid offspring to suffer disproportionately from fertility problems or reduced viability. Typically, the sex that carries two different versions of the sex chromosomes, meaning male offspring in the case of humans and Neanderthals. Genetic evidence supports this directly. Researchers have identified specific regions of the Y chromosome and specific genes linked to sperm production, where Neanderthal genetic variants appear to have been actively selected against in modern human populations, consistent with those variants, causing reduced male fertility whenever they showed up in a hybrid individual. What this means, in plain terms, is that male hybrid offspring, at least the ones carrying a Neanderthal father's Y chromosome, appear to have been reproductively disadvantaged, quite possibly to the point of complete infertility, generation after generation. Over enough time, this would have effectively erased any Neanderthal Y chromosome lineage from the modern human gene pool entirely, regardless of how many times that specific pairing might have initially occurred. The Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA disappearance likely reflects something related but slightly different, involving population dynamics rather than direct genetic incompatibility. Successful gene flow between the two populations appears to have depended heavily on repeated backcrossing, meaning hybrid daughters, carrying Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA from a Neanderthal mother, would need to successfully mate with modern human males across many successive generations for that lineage to persist. Instead, the genetic record suggests these maternal lineages simply didn't survive the process, likely because populations carrying Neanderthal mitochondrial ancestry were small, isolated, or otherwise disadvantaged, compared to the far larger modern human population they were gradually being absorbed into. If uncovering the darker, more complicated layers hiding underneath a popular feel-good science story interests you, make sure you're subscribed, because ancient DNA keeps forcing exactly this kind of uncomfortable correction across multiple corners of human prehistory. This pattern points towards something considerably less symmetrical than the mutual, equal-footing love story most popular retellings prefer. Whatever mixing occurred between these two populations appears to have flowed in a distinctly lopsided direction, with Neanderthal genetic contributions surviving primarily through daughters who were then absorbed into a much larger surrounding modern human population, while sons carrying Neanderthal paternal lineage appear to have left no surviving genetic trace whatsoever. That's not necessarily proof of violence or coercion specifically, and it's important to be careful here, because the genetic data alone cannot definitively answer that question one way or the other. But it is proof of a relationship dynamic that looks considerably more like demographic absorption of a shrinking population into a... The picture gets darker still once you look at what genetic research has revealed about the internal health of Neanderthal populations themselves, entirely separate from any interaction with modern humans at all. In 2022, researchers sequenced genomes from 13 Neanderthal individuals recovered from Chigirskaya cave in Siberia, and the results painted a genuinely bleak picture of late Neanderthal population structure. Among the individuals studied, researchers identified a father and his teenage daughter along with several other close relatives, all apparently living within the same small community at the same time. Genetic diversity across this entire group was remarkably low, consistent with a small, isolated population that had likely been inbreeding for generations. A pattern researchers compared to genetically endangered species today, where population size has dropped low enough that close relatives are essentially the only available mating partners left. This finding matters enormously for how we should actually understand the broader Neanderthal story. Rather than picturing thriving, widespread Neanderthal communities gradually meeting and mixing with an expanding modern human population on relatively equal terms, the genetic evidence increasingly suggests that at least some late Neanderthal populations were already small, fragmented, and genetically struggling well before modern humans became a significant factor in their story at all. Some researchers studying this broader pattern have suggested that Neanderthal populations may have existed in a kind of chronic low-density state for much of their history, periodically shrinking further during difficult climate periods, never quite recovering the population size or genetic diversity needed for long-term stability. This context reframes the interbreeding story in a considerably less romantic light, rather than two robust, comparably sized populations encountering each other and gradually merging as equals. The genetic evidence increasingly points toward a picture where an expanding, genetically diverse modern human population encountered small, isolated, already struggling Neanderthal groups, absorbing whatever remained of them, at least partially, through a process that left almost no trace of Neanderthal paternal or maternal lineage surviving intact. There's a further complication worth addressing directly, because it's frequently glossed over in more upbeat retellings of this story. Archaeological evidence from multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe has revealed cut marks on Neanderthal bones consistent with defleshing, the deliberate removal of muscle tissue from bone using stone tools, a pattern many researchers interpret as evidence of cannibalism occurring within Neanderthal communities themselves. Sites in France and Belgium in particular have produced skeletal remains showing this kind of processing, alongside similar treatment of animal bones found in the same archaeological layers, suggesting Neanderthals were, at least in some documented instances, butchering members of their own species using the same techniques applied to hunted game. Researchers remain divided on how to interpret this evidence, with some suggesting ritual or symbolic behavior rather than purely nutritional cannibalism, but the practice itself, in some form, appears reasonably well documented across multiple independent sites. It's important to be careful and precise about what this evidence does and doesn't tell us. It doesn't provide any direct evidence connecting cannibalism to interactions between Neanderthals and modern humans specifically, and there's no confirmed archaeological case demonstrating that modern humans and Neanderthals engaged in violent conflict with each other, despite this being a popular assumption in less careful popular science coverage. What this evidence does provide is a considerably more complicated, less idealized picture of Neanderthal social life generally, one that resists the tendency, common in some, corrective narratives responding to the old brutish caveman stereotype, to swing too far in the opposite direction and portray Neanderthals as uniformly gentle, symbolically sophisticated, and socially harmonious in every respect. The honest scientific position sits somewhere between these two extremes, and that middle ground is exactly where the darker, more accurate version of the interbreeding story actually lives. Neanderthals were cognitively sophisticated, capable of symbolic, behavior, careful toolmaking, and complex social structures, a correction to the old brutish stereotype that remains well supported by genuine archaeological evidence. At the same time, their population history in the tens of thousands of years leading up to extinction appears to have involved chronic small population size, documented inbreeding, and at least some evidence of internal violence or cannibalistic practices, none of which fits comfortably into either the old brutish caveman narrative or the newer, more romanticized love story narrative that replaced it. There's another layer to this demographic picture worth walking through carefully, because it helps explain why absorption, rather than blending, is the more accurate description of what likely happened. Population modeling based on Neanderthal genetic diversity suggests their total population across Europe and Western Asia may have numbered only in the low tens of thousands at any given time, spread thinly across a vast geographic range in small, disconnected bands. Modern human populations, expanding out of Africa during the same general period, appear to have been considerably larger and more genetically diverse, likely reflecting larger group sizes, more extensive social networks, and higher overall population growth rates. When a small, thinly spread, genetically fragile population comes into repeated contact with a much larger, faster-growing one, population genetics predicts a specific and fairly grim outcome, one demographers sometimes call genetic swamping. Rather than two populations gradually blending into a roughly even mixture, the smaller population's genetic contribution gets progressively diluted with each successive generation, as its members increasingly have children with members of the much larger surrounding population rather than with each other. Run this process forward across enough generations, and the smaller population's distinct genetic identity effectively disappears, not through violent replacement necessarily, but through simple demographic mathematics working relentlessly in one direction. This appears to be a very close match for what the Neanderthal genetic signature actually looks like today, a small, fading contribution scattered across modern genomes, consistent with a population that was numerically overwhelmed and gradually absorbed, rather than one that merged as an equal, lasting partner. It's also worth being precise about the limits of the cannibalism evidence specifically, since sensationalized coverage sometimes stretches it further than the underlying research actually supports. The defleshing marks, found at sites in France and Belgium, represent a genuinely small number of individuals out of the much larger total collection of Neanderthal remains excavated over more than a century of fieldwork. And researchers studying these specific sites have deliberately avoided generalizing from a handful of examples to broad claims about Neanderthal society as a whole. Some of the same researchers have pointed out that similar defleshing patterns appear occasionally in early modern human remains from the same general period as well, suggesting this may reflect a specific ritual or survival practice occurring in isolated circumstances among multiple different human populations, rather than something uniquely or characteristically Neanderthal. The honest summary here is narrower than headlines often suggest. Some Neanderthal remains show clear evidence of this treatment. That evidence doesn't extend to broad claims about Neanderthal social character generally, and it certainly doesn't provide any direct link to their interactions with modern humans specifically. It simply reinforces the broader point that Neanderthal social life, like most aspects of prehistoric human behavior, resists being flattened into either an idealized or a villainized caricature. So where does this leave the actual interbreeding story itself? The genetic evidence supports a picture considerably more consistent with opportunistic, asymmetric, and likely coercive or at minimum deeply unequal encounters, rather than a mutual symmetric romance between two comparably situated populations. An expanding modern human population, genetically diverse and demographically robust, encountered small, isolated, already struggling Neanderthal communities. Whatever interbreeding occurred left almost no trace of Neanderthal paternal lineage surviving at all, and Neanderthal maternal lineage surviving only long enough to be genetically absorbed and eventually diluted into complete disappearance within the much larger surrounding population. That's a meaningfully different story than two groups falling in love and gradually building a shared future together. It looks considerably more like a small, vulnerable population being absorbed, genetically and eventually completely, into a larger one during the final chapters of its existence. None of this necessarily means the story was defined by widespread violence, and researchers are careful, appropriately, not to overstate what genetic data alone can actually prove about behavior and intention. Genetics can reveal patterns of who successfully reproduced with whom across thousands of years, and it can reveal signatures of population size, health, and genetic diversity with considerable precision. It cannot, on its own, tell us whether any specific encounter between a Neanderthal individual and a modern human individual was consensual, coercive, violent, or something else entirely. That distinction matters, and it's worth resisting the temptation, in either direction, to fill in emotional or narrative details that the genetic evidence simply doesn't and can't provide. This distinction between what genetics can and cannot tell us is worth dwelling on a little longer because it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the moment a story like this gets compressed into a video title or a headline. A genome is, in a very real sense, a record of outcomes, not motives. It can tell researchers, with remarkable precision, which lineages survived, which didn't, and roughly when and where a population's genetic contribution started and stopped. It cannot tell researchers what any individual encounter actually felt like, whether it involved affection, coercion, opportunism, or something that doesn't map cleanly onto any modern category at all. Responsible researchers working in this field are generally very careful to separate these two things, presenting the demographic and genetic patterns clearly, while explicitly declining to speculate about the emotional or social texture of individual relationships that occurred tens of thousands of years ago and left no direct behavioral record behind. That caution is worth carrying into how we talk about this topic too, since it's entirely possible to present the darker, more accurate demographic picture without overstating it into a claim of definite violence that the evidence doesn't actually support. What can be said with confidence, grounded directly in the genetic and archaeological record rather than in narrative preference, is this. The interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans did not occur between two thriving, comparably situated populations meeting as equals. It occurred during the final, genetically fragile chapter of Neanderthal existence, involving small, inbred, isolated communities being gradually absorbed into an expanding modern human population, in a process that left a starkly asymmetric genetic signature, complete loss of Neanderthal paternal lineage, gradual loss of Neanderthal maternal lineage, and a surviving genetic contribution that persists today only in scattered, diluted fragments spread across modern human autosomal DNA. That's a genuinely different story than the one that made headlines back in 2010, and it's worth understanding exactly why the correction matters, not just as a technical footnote for specialists, but as a reminder of how easily an appealing narrative can outrun the more complicated reality sitting underneath it. The original ancient love story framing wasn't necessarily deliberately misleading. It reflected the genuinely exciting, genuinely surprising discovery that interbreeding had occurred at all, a finding significant enough on its own that the more granular, more uncomfortable details took additional years of research to properly untangle. But science, done properly, doesn't stop at the first exciting headline. It keeps digging, keeps comparing new evidence against old assumptions, and keeps refining the story as more data becomes available, even when that refined story turns out to be considerably less comforting than the version that first captured public attention. It's worth asking directly why the romantic framing took hold so easily in the first place, since understanding that helps explain why the correction matters beyond just getting the science right. Part of the answer is simply narrative convenience. A story about two ancient populations falling in love and quietly merging together fits neatly into an uplifting, feel-good structure that translates easily into documentary voiceovers and magazine headlines. A story about a small, genetically struggling population being gradually swamped and absorbed by a larger, expanding one with almost no trace of its paternal lineage surviving at all is a considerably harder story to compress into an inspiring soundbite, even though it's the version much better supported by the actual genetic evidence. There's also a subtler factor at play. A natural human tendency to want our own deep ancestry to reflect something warm and mutual rather than something shaped by demographic imbalance and biological incompatibility. Neither of these explanations makes the romantic framing dishonest exactly, but they do help explain why it spread so readily, and why the more accurate, more sobering picture took years of additional genetic research to properly surface and communicate. The Neanderthal story, viewed through this more complete and more carefully examined genetic lens, isn't really a love story at all. It's a story about the final years of a small, struggling, genetically fragile population, gradually and asymmetrically absorbed into a larger, expanding one, leaving behind only fragments, a scattering of autosomal DNA surviving inside modern genomes, while every direct paternal and maternal lineage connecting back to that vanished population disappeared completely, swallowed by demographic and biological forces considerably darker and considerably more complicated than any simple story of two populations falling in love ever managed to capture.